politician has two ends, a thinking end and a sitting end. Yeah, that's going to get us somewhere. Once again, here's the Valley's longest reigning talk show host, Fred Holland.
Mark Mix, old friend of the show, happens to be president of the National Right to Work Committee and president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. Here on this Labor Day, Mark, we've got the PRO Act hanging out there, and I think the Republicans should be very mindful. This thing has gone through the House, right? It said, and we don't know what's going to happen to it in the Senate. The Republicans were dangerous, took the dangerous track of depending on the courts to deal with Obamacare, and it didn't work out that way. This could be just as disastrous, couldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, Fred. It's really literally a smorgasbord of everything that union officials have desired since the imposition of the National Labor Relations Act back in 1935. If they didn't get it in 1935, they're trying to get it in 2021. And the bill is a real masterpiece. And as you said, it's already passed the House of Representatives with no committee hearings, no testimony, just absolutely Nancy Pelosi saying, you know what, we're going to bring this up today and we're going to send it over to the Senate. And that's what they did. The bill is made up of, first and foremost, the repeal of all 27 right-to-work laws across the country. You know, and Alabama and other states across the nation have basically taken the privilege granted them by the federal government by passing right to work, which is very simple. You get to decide whether or not a labor union gets your money. And you can work whatever decision you make. Whether you decide to give them your money or you don't, in a right-to-work state, you can continue working. Imagine that. But it goes farther. The bill also would begin to move away from secret ballot elections toward card check unionization, which is something that union officials have desired because they rarely win elections anymore when they have them. And if they say their win record is like 60%, but that's because they pull out of all the elections they know they're going to lose before they actually have the votes cast to keep those numbers up and pad their statistics. They're going to implement secondary boycotts, which have been statutory illegal. That means we get to protest the customers of a target that we are after for unionization. Meaning, if you're a baker, they can shut down the flour maker and use that leverage to get you to agree to unionization of your employees. That's illegal almost everywhere in the world, and yet they're trying to implement that here. And then the gig economy is going to be destroyed. They're going to make Uber and Lyft drivers employees so they can be subject to, guess what, Fred? Unionization. You can't unionize independent employees, independent contractors in the country right now, but if the PRO Act passes, then we've got a whole new class of employees that have chosen to turn their machines on and turn their machines off when they're working and choose when they're going to work, and they will be subject to unionization. So there's a lot there, and there's more, but I'll leave it at that. That's enough, I think, isn't it?
So obviously the desire here is, look, I was sadly in my early life, I was involved in a union situation, and it turned out that, I came out on the short end. It didn't help me very much, and the guy that they were trying to unionize, it just made things worse for them. But in any case, this never really, it soon dawned on me that a lot of people at the bottom end of this thing are pawns, right? I mean, this is really, look at the situation in other states or at the federal level where you have this incredible power in the union leadership. But it turns out they don't care particularly for the worker. It's basically just it's if you hate the 1% now, and I keep saying which 1% do you want ruling you? In the case of labor, that 1% is going to take nice vacations and live in big houses, and you may or may not have a job, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Every element of the so-called PRO Act gives union officials more power over rank and file workers. And to your point about them taking nice vacations, if you just look at the story that came out of Detroit, Michigan, and the United Auto Workers Union, that have been into Alabama several times trying to organize automotive plants down there, they've got 12 executives, 2 of their past presidents that are either in jail or on their way to jail for spending $400 on bottles of champagne and $60,000 on cigars and villas in Palm Springs. And kickbacks to their foundations across the country. I mean, it's been the corruption goes with the compulsion. And you're right. They live pretty high on the hog, but the rank and file workers, and especially, in this administration, you have the, quote, most pro-union president in the history of the country in power. And the first thing he does is put operating engineers and welders and linemen out of work on the Keystone Pipeline that were all, guess what, Fred? Union jobs. So, yeah, there's something to be said about the disconnect between union officials and rank and file workers in this country. And you're exactly right with your premise there.
It's interesting because they highly endorsed the president, and then he turned around and fired them. They could not connect the dots, which is amazing to me, frankly.
Yeah, it's so sad. It is laughable because it's so sad. I mean, these rank and file workers, their money was used to elect Joe Biden, who literally within the first week of his presidency put them on the unemployment line. So
what went wrong? I want to go to something, down in Birmingham, they had the big the big election down there at Amazon. And this was from what I can tell, I mean, I wasn't there, I read about it, pretty much a knockdown drag out with big labor trying to unionize these people. And not only did big labor lose, they were pounded, right?
Oh my gosh, yeah. This was an international campaign to unionize some piece of Amazon to get back at Jeff Bezos and allegedly the unfair labor practices that they were implementing at these facilities across the country. And the president made a video about it. Some international union officials came in and said this is a must-win for the unions. And I think at the end of the day, Fred, out of the entire unit, I think the unit was like 5,200 workers. I think they ended up getting maybe 14% of the workers that were eligible to vote for unionization. And I think they got 24% of the workers that actually voted to say yes to unionization after this international campaign that include Hollywood celebrities, the president of the United States, and all these intellectual pundits that show up when issues like this come up. The workers in Bessemer, Alabama said no. And when they started interviewing some of these employees, some of these people that had been in unions before, they said, look, they're treating us fine. And now this NLRB under the National Labor Relations Board under President Biden is actually looking at the election again because there was obviously nefarious activity by the employers. That's the only way that they could have won so overwhelmingly if they somehow rigged the election. And I think the one claim that the union makes is that it was a mail ballot election, so the workers had to mail their ballots in. I think Amazon put a mailbox out in front of the facility so that it would make it easier for workers to vote. And unfortunately, making it easier for workers to submit their mail ballots is somehow an unfair labor practice charge and unjustified under the Act. So we'll see. That story may not be over, but you're right. They voted overwhelmingly against unionization.
I look at you of anybody knows the history, of the labor movement in America. Look, this is not to say there weren't unfair labor practices. I've read stories about, we don't do child labor anymore. Not here. Apparently it's okay in China, and we'll even buy those products. But we've eliminated safety. I mean, there have been reasons over time for some kind of union organizing in areas where safety was a factor or underage workers was a factor. I mean, there has been a benefit, but I guess like anything else, it's kind of like some people in the civil rights movement. If you don't have a bad guy, you kind of lose your job, right? and we've reached a point where unions aren't as necessary in a lot of cases now because people are so well informed. Right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Now, obviously the argument always goes, well, there was a place for unions, and I agree. And I believe there's a place for unions today, and I believe there's a place for unions in the future under the circumstances that you just articulated. But there's no place for compulsion. And that, unfortunately, is the one ingredient in the unionization model that poisons the whole product, that poisons the whole well, if you will. Let me just quote Samuel Gompers. He was known as the father of the American labor movement. In his final speech in El Paso, Texas in 1924, in front of the delegates of the AFL, he said this. He said, "I want to urge devotion to the fundamentals of human liberty, the principles of voluntarism. No lasting gain has ever come from compulsion. If we seek to force, we but tear apart that which united is invincible." And the reason why Gompers had to give that speech was because the delegates of the AFL were thinking about going to Washington to have government grant them power. Well, unfortunately, Gompers got overruled, and the delegates went, and they got the Railway Labor Act in 1930. 1926, and then they got the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, and that legislation had the power of compulsion. Union officials became political animals as opposed to a business enterprise that went out and said, hey, here's what we can do for you. Why don't you join us voluntarily? They went to government for these privileges, and that's why they've got to play politics the way they do, Fred, because they are wards of the state. Their power is a derivative of government action. So where's the action for the AFL-CIO? It's in Washington, D.C. It's in Montgomery, Alabama. It's in Sacramento, California. But it sure ain't on the shop floor, and that's their problem.
So what do you think this thing's prospects? And look, Joe Manchin has already apparently derailed the big budget bill, or they got the infrastructure bill, but this other one looks like it's not going to make it. This $3.5 trillion thing. It looks like he's not going to go along. And there's some other Democrats that apparently in I think Sinema in Arizona is one of those. This sounds to me like perhaps people that may be hopefully against this PRO Act, because if it does get passed, where do we go from here?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question, and there's obviously legal implications for it that will obviously exhaust if it ever did get passed. But really what the game is changing the Senate rules. They don't have the votes, and I think there are a lot of politicians that are actually happy that the filibuster exists, because as long as the filibuster exists, they can posture and they can beat their chest about how unfair things are, but they won't have a chance to implement policy. It's like the Green New Deal. I mean, you can be the greatest advocate for the so-called Green New Deal, but until they do away with the filibuster, a lot of the elements of that are not going to be implemented. And Joe Manchin is a perfect example of that. I mean, if they break the filibuster and they can pass the so-called Green New Deal with a majority vote in the Senate, then the coal industry in West Virginia are decimated, no question about it. So on one hand, you have the politics, the internal politics of the Senate rules that protects a lot of politicians who, shall I say, and try to be fragile with this, that don't really have a whole lot of courage to stand up and say, yeah, I'm willing to bet my political life on an issue like this. When it comes to right to work, I think the people of Alabama spoke pretty clearly. They put it in their constitution with something like an 80% vote down there a couple years back. Unfortunately, that constitutional protection doesn't mean much, because the right to work privilege is a privilege granted by the federal government. And so if the PRO Act passes, notwithstanding the fact that the right to work protections are in the Alabama Constitution, they will not stand. They will be preempted by federal law. So, guys like Manchin, but the problem is there's Republicans on the other side that get pretty weak-kneed from time to time, and you never know what they're going to do. So, yeah. The only thing we can do, Fred, is keep the pressure on them. Just keep the pressure and remind them again and again and again that we're watching. And that's the only way we get to hold politicians accountable. The more they do in secret, the more damage they do. The more we shine the sunlight on their actions, the better chance we have of defending against things like this.
So, look, I keep on this particular issue, and I don't want to belittle it, saying that this couldn't happen, but there are tons of silver linings here. I mean, you got a governor of Colorado who just happens to be a Democrat, but he seems to be a business guy, and seems to be in favor of not tinkering too much. You also have members of the Senate in some of these states where it is right to work, and I don't think they want to cut their own throats. I hope. Right.
That's exactly right. Well, Manchin's from a right-to-work state. Kristen Sinema's from a right-to-work state. Mark Kelly's from a right-to-work state. Raphael Warnock, who's up for election coming November. Not this November, but next November, from Georgia, he's in a right-to-work state. So, yeah, those are the kind of the thought. That's the thought process that politicians go through. I mean, because we know this, Fred, and this is a question. This will be on the test. What's the first thing a politician thinks about after getting elected?
Themselves.
How to get reelected. Yeah, I think the answer is I'm going to my judge to see if that's going to work. I won't buzz you out because that answer works. They think about themselves, but getting reelected is the first thing they think about. And notwithstanding, there have been very few people that have ever come to Washington that haven't calculated like that. There are a few, and don't get me wrong, there are a few that have done that, and we need more of those types of folks. But generally, with the power that these people have and kind of the sycophantic support they get once they get inside the Beltway and get protected here, I mean, it's a pretty good deal, and they like it, and they don't want to lose it. And so politics plays into all that. But to your point, that's how we hold them accountable, and that's what this is all about. I mean, it was Madison or Jefferson. I think it was Jefferson. Maybe both of them said it, that the only way we can protect our form of government is to have educated people, meaning we know what they're doing. And this is how we get there. Your show, we get there telling them about it. We're talking about it now. This will play, on this day that's been designated by President Joe Biden in a resolution just moment, I think back on Friday that said, we've got to praise union officials about Labor Day. Well, I think we should celebrate the American worker, 94% who are not in unions. I think they're just as, they should be honored just the same. So, it's good that we do that.
Let's keep the politicians out of this. I'm reminded by the Chad Mitchell Trio song about, a politician has two ends, a thinking end and a sitting end. And they really care about both of those. So, yeah, let's celebrate the worker and try to keep government out of this because, look, you're worth it, right, as a worker. Advocate for yourself, right? You can do that.
That's right. All right. And notwithstanding the acronym of the PRO Act, there's nothing that stops people from joining unions in American law. So that's the truth of it, and that's what we should be celebrating on Labor Day.
Hey, I'm glad you made the point that you're not anti-union. You're just anti being forced to join a union, right?
That's right, Fred. That's simple.
Mark Mix, who is president of the National Right to Work Committee and president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation on this Labor Day. Hey, if people want to catch up with you, find out more about what you do, where do they go?
They can find us on that amazing internet at nrtw.org, nrtw.org.
Sane solutions for an insane world. Fred Holland.